He has been parking there for weeks. Somebody needs to do something. Karen Whitmore pressed the phone tighter against her ear as she stood behind the living room curtain, staring through the front window of her neatly maintained suburban home. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the quiet street. The neighborhood looked exactly as it always did: trimmed lawns, freshly painted mailboxes, and children riding bicycles beneath rows of maple trees. Yet Karen's attention remained fixed on a dark pickup truck parked along the curb across from her house. The truck belonged to the newest resident on the block, a man named Marcus Reed. She had seen him almost every day since he moved in 3 months earlier. He left early in the morning, returned around dinner time, and drove the same older pickup truck that, in Karen's opinion, looked completely out of place among the luxury SUVs and polished sedans parked throughout the neighborhood. "Ma'am," the city employee on the phone replied politely, "has the vehicle violated any posted parking restrictions?" Karen hesitated. "Well, not exactly." She continued watching Marcus's house. "But it has been sitting there regularly, and I think someone should check whether it is allowed." The employee asked a few more questions before ending the call and assuring her that a parking inspector would review the complaint. Karen thanked him and hung up. For a moment she felt satisfied. She told herself she was protecting the neighborhood, maintaining standards, looking out for property values. At least that was the explanation she repeated in her mind whenever doubt tried to surface. Across the street, the front door of Marcus's house opened. The tall black man stepped outside carrying a cardboard box. He wore faded jeans, work boots, and a plain gray shirt. Sweat darkened the collar from a long day of work. Karen watched as he carefully loaded the box into the truck before returning to the house. Nothing about him appeared unusual, yet something about his presence continued bothering her. She could not explain it clearly even to herself. The feeling simply lingered. About 30 minutes later, a white city vehicle slowly turned onto the street. Karen immediately recognized the municipal logo on the door. Her pulse quickened. The parking inspector had arrived faster than expected. The vehicle pulled over near Marcus's truck. The inspector stepped out carrying a tablet and began examining the area. Karen moved closer to the window, careful not to be seen. This was exactly what she wanted. A formal review. An objective assessment. Proof that her concerns had been justified. The inspector circled the truck, checked nearby signs, measured distance from the curb, and entered notes into the tablet. After several minutes, Marcus emerged from his house again. He noticed the inspector immediately and walked over with a calm expression. There was no irritation in his face, no confrontation. He simply greeted the city employee with a polite smile and extended his hand. The inspector shook it. The two men began talking casually beside the truck. Karen could not hear their conversation from inside her house, but she noticed something unexpected. Both men seemed relaxed. At one point, the inspector even laughed. Marcus smiled in return. The exchange looked less like an investigation and more like a friendly discussion between neighbors. Karen frowned. That was not how she imagined this moment would unfold. She leaned forward, trying to understand what was happening. Across the street, the conversation continued. The evening sunlight reflected from the truck's windshield while a warm breeze rustled the trees overhead. Then, to Karen's surprise, the inspector nodded respectfully toward Marcus before glancing at the house behind him. Whatever was happening, it was clearly not going the way she expected. And she had no idea that before the week was over, she would learn a truth about Marcus Reed that would leave her completely speechless. Karen Whitmore remained near the window long after the city inspector drove away. The conversation she had witnessed from a distance continued replaying in her mind. She had expected concern, perhaps even a citation. Instead, the inspector had left with a friendly wave and a smile. Marcus Reed had returned to his house looking completely unbothered. The outcome irritated her more than she cared to admit. Later that evening, as the last light faded from the sky, she sat alone in her kitchen reviewing the neighborhood social media page on her tablet. Photos from block parties, community events, and seasonal gatherings filled the screen. She had always considered herself one of the people responsible for maintaining the character of the neighborhood. She attended homeowners association meetings. She kept her property immaculate. She followed every local ordinance carefully. Yet something about Marcus continued bothering her in a way she could not fully explain. The next morning she noticed his truck again. It sat exactly where it had been the day before, parked legally along the curb. Marcus emerged shortly after sunrise carrying a travel mug and a worn leather folder. He locked his front door and walked toward the truck. Karen watched from behind the blinds while sipping coffee. He looked like an ordinary working man. Nothing more. No luxury watch. No expensive clothing. No visible signs of wealth. Just faded jeans, work boots, and a calm expression. He climbed into the truck and drove away. Karen found herself staring at the empty space long after he disappeared around the corner. Throughout the day, she mentioned Marcus several times during conversations with friends. At lunch, she met her neighbor Susan at a small cafe downtown. While discussing local events, Karen casually brought him up. "Have you met the new man on Oak Ridge Lane?" she asked. Susan smiled immediately. "Marcus? Yes. Very nice guy." Karen blinked. "You know him?" "A little," Susan replied. "He helped my father carry groceries a few weeks ago when his back was bothering him." Karen stirred her iced tea. "Really?" Susan nodded. "Very polite." The answer disappointed her. She had expected agreement. Instead, she received praise. That evening, Karen returned home and found herself looking across the street again. Marcus was unloading supplies from the truck. Several large bags rested in the bed. Before she could study them further, an elderly resident from 3 houses down approached him. The older man appeared to be struggling with a damaged section of fencing near his driveway. Marcus immediately set down what he was carrying and walked over. For nearly 30 minutes, the two worked together beneath the warm glow of the setting sun. They laughed occasionally while adjusting boards and securing loose hardware. When they finished, the elderly man shook Marcus's hand with obvious gratitude. Marcus simply smiled and returned to unloading his truck. Karen watched the entire interaction from her porch. It was a small moment. Simple. Ordinary. Yet it complicated the image she had created in her head. People she trusted seemed to like him. City officials appeared comfortable around him. Neighbors greeted him warmly. None of it fit the assumption she had quietly formed since his arrival. Still, she pushed the doubts aside. There had to be something she was missing, something nobody else had noticed. As darkness settled over the neighborhood, Karen looked toward Marcus's house one final time. Lights glowed softly through the windows. The truck sat peacefully along the curb. Everything appeared normal. Yet for reasons she could not explain, she became even more determined to learn exactly who Marcus Reed really was. Over the next several days, Karen Whitmore developed a routine she would never have admitted to anyone. Each morning, she found herself glancing through the front window to see when Marcus Reed left for work. Each evening, she noticed when he returned. What began as curiosity slowly turned into a quiet obsession. She told herself she was simply paying attention to the neighborhood, watching for details, looking out for the community. Yet deep down, she knew she spent far more time thinking about Marcus than any other neighbor on the street. One Thursday afternoon, she was trimming flowers near her front walkway when she noticed Marcus pulling into his driveway. The familiar pickup truck rolled to a stop, and he stepped out carrying several long pieces of lumber in the truck bed. Karen paused her gardening and watched discreetly. A few minutes later, she saw 2 children from nearby houses riding bicycles toward Marcus's property. The younger boy lost control while turning too quickly and nearly crashed into a mailbox. Before Karen could react, Marcus calmly stepped forward and steadied the bicycle. The boy laughed nervously. Marcus smiled and crouched beside him, speaking for a moment before helping adjust the loose chain that had slipped from the gears. Within minutes, the bicycle was working again. The children thanked him and continued riding down the street. Karen returned to trimming flowers, but the image stayed with her. That evening, another small moment unfolded. An elderly woman named Margaret Ellis, who lived at the corner of the block, struggled to carry several grocery bags from her car. Marcus happened to be outside collecting mail. Without hesitation, he crossed the street and offered assistance. Margaret accepted gratefully. Together they carried the bags inside her home. 10 minutes later, Marcus emerged and continued with his evening as though nothing unusual had happened. There was no audience, no attention, no attempt to impress anyone. He simply helped because someone needed help. The pattern continued throughout the week. On Saturday morning, Karen noticed Marcus picking up litter that had blown into a vacant lot nearby. Later that afternoon, he helped a young couple move furniture into a newly purchased home. On Sunday, he spent nearly an hour speaking with a local veteran who often sat alone on his front porch. Every interaction appeared genuine. Every conversation seemed easy and respectful. Yet despite everything she witnessed, Karen continued searching for reasons to justify her original concerns. One evening, she attended a neighborhood gathering hosted by several longtime residents. The conversation eventually shifted toward recent changes in the community. Without mentioning Marcus directly, Karen carefully tested the waters. "It seems like we have had a lot of new people moving into the area lately," she said. Several neighbors nodded. "That is true," replied Tom Henderson, a retired teacher. "Some excellent additions, too." Another resident smiled. "Especially Marcus. He has been wonderful." Karen felt her stomach tighten slightly. "You know him well?" she asked. Tom laughed softly. "Not well enough. But every time somebody needs help, he somehow shows up." Several others immediately agreed. Stories followed one after another. A repaired fence. Help carrying supplies. Advice offered to a struggling small business owner. Assistance during a recent storm cleanup. Karen listened quietly while everyone else spoke positively about the man she still barely understood. As she drove home later that night, the streetlights reflected across her windshield. The neighborhood looked peaceful, familiar, safe. Yet for the first time, Karen found herself facing a possibility she had worked hard to avoid. What if the problem she kept searching for did not exist at all? The question followed Karen Whitmore throughout the next week. What if the problem she kept searching for did not exist at all? She tried dismissing the thought, but it returned whenever she looked across the street at Marcus Reed's house. The more she observed him, the more difficult it became to reconcile her suspicions with the reality unfolding in front of her. Still, part of her refused to let go. She had spent years trusting her instincts. She considered herself a good judge of character. Admitting she might have been wrong felt strangely uncomfortable. One warm Tuesday evening, Karen attended a monthly homeowners association meeting held at the neighborhood clubhouse. The room smelled faintly of coffee and printer paper. Residents sat around folding tables discussing landscaping schedules, street maintenance, and upcoming community events. Karen arrived early and took her usual seat near the front. As the meeting progressed, she noticed several residents mentioning volunteer projects planned for the coming weekend. What surprised her was how often Marcus's name appeared in the conversation. "Marcus already offered equipment for the cleanup," one resident said. "Marcus helped coordinate the volunteers last time," another added. Someone else mentioned that Marcus had donated materials for a small park improvement project. Karen sat quietly listening. Nobody spoke about him as though he were a newcomer. They spoke about him as though he had been part of the community for years. After the meeting ended, she approached the association president, a longtime resident named Daniel Foster. "Can I ask you something?" she said. Daniel smiled. "Of course." Karen hesitated. "Marcus Reed seems pretty involved around here." Daniel laughed softly. "That is one way to put it." "What do you mean?" Karen asked. Daniel gathered a few papers before answering. "Let us just say he spends more time helping people than talking about himself." Before Karen could ask another question, Daniel was called away by another resident. The conversation ended, leaving her with even more questions than before. 2 days later, another unexpected moment occurred. Karen returned home from grocery shopping and noticed a small group gathered near a vacant lot at the end of the block. Curious, she parked her car and walked closer. Several neighborhood children stood beside stacks of lumber, while adults reviewed sketches spread across a folding table. At the center of the group was Marcus. He listened carefully as children pointed excitedly at drawings. Karen eventually overheard enough to understand what was happening. The group was planning a new playground area for local families. Marcus was volunteering his time to help organize the project. One little girl tugged on his sleeve and asked whether the swings would be painted blue. Marcus smiled and promised they would discuss every color option before making a decision. The children laughed. The adults smiled. The entire scene felt effortless. Genuine. Karen remained at a distance, watching. Once again, there was no audience for Marcus to impress. No cameras. No publicity. Just neighbors working together. As the sun began setting behind the rooftops, golden light spread across the vacant lot. The children headed home. Volunteers packed supplies into vehicles. Marcus stayed behind to help clean up before finally walking toward his truck. For a brief moment, his eyes met Karen's across the street. He offered a polite nod and a friendly smile. Karen instinctively nodded back. Then he climbed into the truck and drove away. Standing alone beneath the fading evening sky, Karen felt something she had not expected. The certainty that had fueled her complaint was beginning to crack. Yet she still had no idea that the biggest revelation about Marcus Reed was waiting just around the corner. The following Saturday arrived bright and clear, and by 8 o'clock in the morning the vacant lot at the end of the block was already full of activity. Volunteers carried tools, children gathered around stacks of lumber, and parents unloaded coolers filled with water and snacks. Karen Whitmore had not planned on attending. In fact, she had spent most of the week telling herself she had no reason to be interested. Yet curiosity eventually won. Shortly after 9 o'clock, she found herself walking toward the project site with a travel mug in her hand. Nobody seemed surprised to see her. Several neighbors greeted her warmly. The atmosphere felt less like a construction project and more like a community celebration. At the center of everything stood Marcus Reed. He moved calmly between groups, answering questions, helping organize supplies, and making sure everyone had what they needed. What struck Karen immediately was how many people seemed genuinely happy to see him. Children ran up to greet him. Elderly residents stopped to shake his hand. Volunteers listened carefully when he spoke. The respect was obvious, but it did not appear connected to authority. It felt personal, earned. Throughout the morning, Karen remained mostly on the sidelines. She watched Marcus help a young father assemble a picnic table. Later he spent 20 minutes teaching a group of teenagers how to safely use measuring tools. When a little boy became frustrated while helping paint wooden panels, Marcus knelt beside him and patiently encouraged him until the child started smiling again. None of it felt performative. There were no speeches, no attempts to impress anyone, just consistent acts of kindness. Around lunchtime, volunteers gathered beneath a temporary shade tent. Conversations filled the air while people shared sandwiches and cold drinks. Karen eventually found herself sitting near two longtime residents, Margaret Ellis and Tom Henderson. As they talked, the conversation naturally shifted toward Marcus. "The neighborhood is lucky to have him," Margaret said. Tom nodded immediately. "Luckier than most people realize." Karen looked up. "What do you mean by that?" Tom exchanged a glance with Margaret before smiling. "Marcus never talks about himself, does he?" "Not that I have noticed," Karen admitted. Margaret laughed softly. "That sounds about right." Before Karen could ask more questions, another volunteer approached their table. The woman introduced herself as Rachel. During the conversation, she casually mentioned that Marcus had helped fund several youth programs in nearby communities. Karen blinked. "Fund them?" Rachel nodded. "A lot of people do not know that. He prefers it that way." Karen sat quietly. The statement caught her off guard. Marcus certainly did not look like someone funding community programs, yet the certainty in Rachel's voice left little room for doubt. The rest of the afternoon only deepened the mystery. More stories surfaced naturally in conversation. Someone mentioned scholarships. Another referenced a small business grant program. A retired teacher described resources that had helped dozens of students over the years. Strangely, Marcus's name seemed connected to all of them, but never in a way that drew attention to himself. By late afternoon, the framework for the playground had begun taking shape. Children cheered as the first swing supports were installed. Parents applauded. Volunteers exchanged tired but satisfied smiles. Standing near the edge of the lot, Karen looked across the crowd toward Marcus. He was carrying equipment alongside everyone else, dressed in the same worn boots and faded jeans she had seen since the day he arrived. Yet for the first time she found herself wondering whether she had misunderstood far more than a parked truck. Because the deeper she looked, the harder it became to understand how one quiet man could be connected to so many lives. By Monday morning, The playground project had become the main topic of conversation throughout the neighborhood. Freshly installed swing frames stood against the bright blue sky, and children rode bicycles past the site every afternoon to check the progress. Karen Whitmore found herself doing the same thing. She no longer watched Marcus read with suspicion. Instead, she watched with growing curiosity. The stories she had heard during the weekend refused to leave her mind. Scholarships, community programs, small business support. None of it matched the image she had created when he first moved onto the street. A few days later, Karen stopped at a local coffee shop on her way home from an appointment. The cafe sat near the center of town and was popular with residents from several nearby neighborhoods. As she waited for her order, she noticed Marcus seated alone near a window reviewing documents inside a thick binder. For a brief moment she considered leaving before he noticed her. Instead, she ordered her coffee and chose a table nearby. Marcus looked up, recognized her immediately, and offered a friendly smile. "Good afternoon," he said. "Good afternoon," Karen replied. The exchange lasted only a few seconds, yet she felt strangely uncomfortable. Not because Marcus had done anything wrong. Quite the opposite. He had every reason to be cold toward her if he knew about the parking complaint. Yet his expression carried no resentment whatsoever. Several minutes later, another customer approached Marcus's table. The man appeared to own one of the small hardware stores downtown. Karen recognized him immediately. The conversation that followed was impossible to ignore. "I still do not know how to thank you," the store owner said. Marcus smiled. "You already did." "No," the man replied. "You helped keep my doors open." Marcus gently shook his head. "You did the hard work. I only helped where I could." The store owner laughed. "That sounds exactly like something you would say." They spoke for a few more minutes before the man left. Karen stared into her coffee cup. Another story. Another person expressing gratitude. Another piece of a puzzle she still could not fully see. Later that week, she encountered something even more surprising. A community newsletter arrived in her mailbox announcing an upcoming town meeting, focused on neighborhood development projects. As she scanned the schedule, one section caught her attention. Several major improvements completed during the past 5 years would be reviewed, including youth education initiatives, housing rehabilitation programs, small business grants, and public recreation upgrades. Karen recognized many of the projects from conversations she had heard recently. What surprised her was a single sentence near the bottom of the page. Special recognition would be given to local contributors whose support made these projects possible. For reasons she could not explain, Marcus immediately came to mind. The thought stayed with her for the rest of the day. That evening, as golden sunlight settled across Oak Ridge Lane, Karen stepped onto her porch. Across the street, Marcus was watering flowers near his front walkway. The scene looked ordinary, peaceful. A man taking care of his home at the end of a long day. Yet the more she learned, the less ordinary he seemed. For months she had assumed she understood exactly who he was. Now she was beginning to realize she knew almost nothing at all. And somewhere beyond the questions, beyond the rumors, beyond the quiet acts of kindness, a much larger truth was waiting to be revealed. The town meeting arrived on a cool Thursday evening. Residents filled the community center long before the presentation began. Folding chairs stretched across the room, and conversations echoed beneath bright overhead lights. Karen Whitmore took a seat near the middle and unfolded the agenda she had received at the entrance. Around her, neighbors greeted one another warmly. Several people waved when Marcus Reed entered a few minutes later. He responded with the same quiet smile Karen had come to recognize. Nothing about him suggested he expected special attention. He simply found an empty seat near the side of the room and listened as the meeting began. The first portion focused on recent improvements throughout the area. City officials reviewed completed projects, including renovated playgrounds, youth mentorship programs, small business assistance initiatives, and housing rehabilitation efforts. As photographs appeared on a large screen at the front of the room, Karen noticed something unusual. Many of the projects looked familiar. Some had been mentioned during conversations she had overheard. Others were programs neighbors had praised repeatedly over the past few weeks. The presenter spoke about families who had received support during difficult times. students who had earned scholarships, local businesses that had survived economic downturns, community spaces that had been restored instead of abandoned. The room responded with frequent applause. Karen listened carefully. Then a city administrator stepped forward and introduced the next segment. "Tonight," he said, "we would also like to recognize individuals whose contributions helped make these programs possible." A slide appeared showing several community leaders. Karen studied the photographs while people applauded. Then another slide replaced the first. This time, a single name appeared beneath a series of project images. Marcus Reed. Karen blinked. Around the room, smiles spread across familiar faces. The administrator continued speaking. He described years of private donations, educational funding, neighborhood investments, and business development support. He explained that numerous community projects had moved forward because of resources provided by one individual who consistently chose to remain behind the scenes. Karen felt her pulse quicken. She looked across the room toward Marcus. He appeared almost uncomfortable with the attention. While applause filled the building, he lowered his eyes and offered a modest nod. The administrator continued. Over the past decade, Marcus had quietly helped finance scholarship opportunities for hundreds of students. He had invested in struggling neighborhoods throughout the region. He had supported housing improvements, youth programs, job training initiatives, and small business recovery efforts. Again and again, the same message emerged. Marcus had never sought recognition. He simply believed strong communities were built by helping people succeed. Karen sat completely still. The stories she had heard suddenly connected together. The grateful shop owner, the scholarship programs, the playground project, the respect neighbors showed whenever his name appeared in conversation. None of it had been coincidence. She remembered the parking complaint, the hours spent watching him from her window, the assumption she had formed before learning a single fact about his life. A feeling of embarrassment settled heavily in her chest. Yet the surprises were not over. The administrator smiled and revealed one final detail. Marcus was also one of the largest private investors responsible for preserving affordable housing and revitalizing multiple neighborhoods throughout the city. The room erupted into applause once more. Karen looked around and saw admiration on nearly every face. Then she looked back at Marcus. For the first time since he moved onto Oak Ridge Lane, she truly understood why everyone respected him. And for the first time she realized how wrong she had been. When the meeting finally ended, people lingered throughout the community center long after the official presentations were finished. Small groups formed near the exits, discussing projects, sharing stories, and congratulating volunteers. The atmosphere felt warm and celebratory. Yet Karen Whitmore remained seated for several moments after everyone else began standing. The applause still echoed in her memory. More importantly, so did the realization of how little she had known about Marcus Reed. One by one, the assumptions she had carried since the day he moved into the neighborhood seemed to dissolve beneath the weight of the facts she had just heard. Eventually, she rose from her chair and slowly made her way toward the lobby. Across the room, Marcus was speaking with several residents. Parents thanked him for youth programs. Business owners expressed gratitude for opportunities he had helped create. Students smiled while sharing stories about scholarships and mentorship initiatives. Through every conversation, Marcus responded the same way. He redirected praise toward others. He listened more than he spoke. He treated everyone with equal attention and respect. Karen stood near the doorway watching. For the first time, she felt uncomfortable not because of Marcus but because of herself. As she stepped outside into the cool evening air, she noticed two women standing near the parking lot discussing the presentation. One of them was Rachel, the volunteer she had met during the playground project. The other was a school counselor from a nearby district. Karen approached quietly and joined their conversation. Before long, the counselor began describing a scholarship program that had helped dozens of students attend college. Many of those kids would never have had the opportunity otherwise, she said. Marcus never wanted publicity. He just wanted them to have a chance. Rachel nodded. That sounds exactly like him. The counselor smiled. A few years ago, one student lost both parents within months of each other. Marcus paid for tutoring, transportation, and school expenses without ever telling anyone. Karen felt her chest tighten. Another story. Another example. Another reminder that she had spent months focusing on a parked truck, while overlooking the character of the man behind the wheel. The drive home felt unusually quiet. Streetlights passed across her windshield as she replayed the evening in her mind. Every memory now carried a different meaning. The grocery bags he helped carry, the bicycle chain he repaired, the playground project, the small business owner at the coffee shop. None of those moments had been isolated acts. They were simply reflections of the person Marcus had always been. When she arrived home, Karen remained inside her car for several minutes. Across the street, lights glowed softly inside Marcus's house. The same house she had watched countless times through her window. The same neighbor she had judged before learning a single meaningful fact about his life. For the first time, she began asking herself difficult questions. Why had she assumed he did not belong? Why had she viewed him differently from other residents? Why had an old pickup truck and work boots influenced her perception so strongly? The answers were uncomfortable, yet they were impossible to avoid. Later that night, long after the neighborhood had gone quiet, Karen stood at her bedroom window looking across the street. A soft porch light illuminated Marcus's front walkway. Everything appeared peaceful, ordinary, yet nothing felt ordinary anymore. Because while the rest of the neighborhood had known Marcus for who he truly was, Karen was only beginning to see the truth. And the more clearly she saw it, the more she realized that the biggest change taking place was not happening across the street. It was happening inside her. The days following the town meeting felt different to Karen Whitmore. The neighborhood itself had not changed. Children still rode bicycles beneath the trees. Residents still walked their dogs in the evening. Porch lights still glowed softly as dusk settled across Oak Ridge Lane. Yet something inside Karen had shifted. For the first time since Marcus Reed moved into the neighborhood, she stopped watching him through the lens of suspicion. Instead, she began noticing details she had ignored before. She noticed how often people stopped to greet him. She noticed how naturally conversations formed around him. Most importantly, she noticed how consistently he treated everyone with the same quiet respect. One Saturday morning, Karen was collecting mail when she spotted Marcus speaking with a young couple near the end of the street. The couple looked worried. They gestured toward a nearby house while discussing paperwork spread across the hood of a car. Marcus listened carefully before offering suggestions. The conversation lasted nearly 20 minutes. When it ended, both individuals looked visibly relieved. Karen found herself wondering how many similar moments she had missed over the past few months. Later that afternoon, she attended the grand opening of the neighborhood playground. Families gathered beneath bright blue skies while children raced toward the swings and climbing structures. Volunteers who had helped build the project exchanged smiles and photographs. A small ribbon-cutting ceremony took place near the entrance. As community leaders thanked residents for their efforts, Karen observed something familiar. Whenever praise drifted toward Marcus, he redirected attention toward volunteers, families, and organizers. He seemed genuinely more comfortable celebrating others than himself. During the event, Karen overheard another conversation that deepened her understanding. A former scholarship recipient approached Marcus carrying a toddler in her arms. The woman introduced her young son before thanking Marcus for helping her attend college years earlier. Marcus smiled and congratulated her on everything she had accomplished. The woman became emotional while describing how different her life might have been without the opportunities she had received. Once again, Marcus responded with humility. He never spoke about what he had given. He focused entirely on what she had achieved. Watching from nearby, Karen felt a growing sense of regret. The realization no longer arrived in sharp bursts. It settled quietly, becoming impossible to ignore. She remembered the phone call she had made. She remembered watching the city inspector arrive. She remembered convincing herself that Marcus did not belong. Every memory now felt smaller than before. That evening, after the playground celebration ended, Karen walked home beneath a sky painted with orange and gold. Children laughed in the distance while families slowly packed their belongings into vehicles. Across the street, Marcus was loading folding chairs into his pickup truck. The same truck that had started everything. Karen paused at the edge of her driveway and looked toward him. For a brief moment, she considered walking across the street and telling him the truth. She imagined explaining the complaint, admitting the assumptions she had made. apologizing for judging him before knowing him. But fear stopped her. Not fear of anger. Marcus had never shown anger. It was fear of facing her own mistakes out loud. So she remained where she was while Marcus finished loading supplies. Before getting into the truck, he glanced across the street and offered the same friendly smile he always did. Karen returned the smile. Yet as he drove away into the fading evening light, she knew the moment she had been avoiding could not be delayed much longer. Because now that she understood who Marcus Reed truly was, the only person left to confront was herself. The following week brought an unexpected opportunity. The annual Community Advancement Gala was scheduled for Friday evening, an event that gathered local business owners, educators, nonprofit leaders, and residents from across the city. Karen Whitmore had attended several times over the years, but this time felt different. Ever since the town meeting, she had carried a growing awareness that she needed to speak with Marcus Reed. Yet every time the opportunity appeared, she hesitated. She knew an apology was necessary. She simply did not know how to begin. On the night of the event, the ballroom shimmered beneath warm lights reflected across polished floors and white table linens. Conversations flowed easily throughout the room while guests mingled near displays highlighting recent community achievements. Karen arrived early and quietly found her seat near the back. Across the room, she noticed Marcus speaking with a group of educators. As always, he appeared comfortable but never eager for attention. Several people approached him throughout the evening. He greeted each person with the same calm smile. As dinner concluded, the Master of Ceremonies stepped onto the stage and began presenting awards recognizing contributions to regional development and community improvement. One by one, recipients were announced. Then came the final presentation of the evening. The room grew noticeably quieter as a large screen illuminated behind the stage. Images began appearing. Renovated housing projects, youth mentorship programs, small business success stories, scholarship recipients celebrating graduations, playgrounds filled with children, community centers serving families. Karen immediately recognized many of the projects. She had heard about them during the past several months. Some were connected to stories neighbors had shared. Others had been discussed during the town meeting. Then a familiar name appeared across the screen. Marcus Reed. Applause filled the ballroom. Guests rose from their seats in a standing ovation that seemed to continue forever. Karen looked around and saw genuine admiration everywhere. The presenter spoke about years of investment, leadership, and service. Yet one statement captured the room more than any other. The remarkable thing about Marcus Reed is not how much he has accomplished, the presenter said. It is how many people he has helped without ever asking for recognition. The applause grew louder. Marcus eventually walked to the stage and accepted the award. Standing beneath the spotlight, he looked almost embarrassed by the attention. When the room finally became quiet, he delivered a brief speech. He thanked volunteers, teachers, parents, business owners, and community leaders. He spoke about opportunity, dignity, and investing in people rather than projects. Then he said something that stayed with Karen long after the evening ended. Every strong neighborhood begins the same way, Marcus said. People choose to see one another as neighbors before they see differences. Silence settled across the ballroom. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind that follows a truth everyone immediately understands. Karen felt those words more deeply than anyone around her could possibly know. On the drive home, city lights reflected across her windshield while Marcus's speech replayed in her mind. By the time she turned onto Oak Ridge Lane, she had reached a decision. She could no longer avoid the conversation she needed to have. The apology she had postponed for weeks would happen soon. Because after everything she had learned, remaining silent felt far worse than admitting she had been wrong. Saturday morning arrived with clear skies and a cool breeze moving through the trees that lined Oak Ridge Lane. Karen Whitmore woke earlier than usual. She had spent most of the previous night thinking about the decision she had made after the gala. The longer she delayed the conversation, the more difficult it seemed to become. Yet she knew there was no longer any reason to wait. After finishing her coffee, she stood near the front window and looked across the street. Marcus Reed was outside trimming hedges near his driveway. The familiar pickup truck sat parked nearby beneath the soft morning sunlight. For a moment Karen considered turning away and postponing the conversation again. Then she took a deep breath, stepped outside and crossed the street. Marcus noticed her approaching and immediately set down the gardening shears. "Good morning," he said with his usual smile. "Good morning," Karen replied. Her voice felt tighter than she expected. Marcus sensed her nervousness but remained relaxed. "Everything all right?" he asked. Karen glanced toward the street before looking back at him. "Actually, there is something I need to tell you." Marcus nodded patiently. "Of course." For several seconds, Karen struggled to find the right words. Months of assumptions, embarrassment, and regret seemed impossible to summarize. Finally, she chose honesty. "When you first moved here, I made some unfair judgments about you." Marcus remained silent, allowing her to continue. "I thought I understood who you were without ever taking the time to know you." Karen lowered her eyes briefly. "And the parking complaint that brought the city inspector to your truck a few months ago?" She paused. "That was me." The words hung quietly between them. Birds chirped somewhere down the block. A gentle breeze moved through the leaves overhead. Marcus did not react with anger. He did not appear surprised. Instead, he listened. Karen continued speaking. "I convinced myself I was protecting the neighborhood. But the truth is, I made assumptions that were not fair. I judged you before I knew anything about you. And after everything I have learned, I am ashamed of that." Her voice softened. "I am sorry." Silence followed. Not an uncomfortable silence. Just a quiet moment where nothing needed to be rushed. Marcus looked across the street toward the neighborhood that surrounded them. Then he smiled gently. "Thank you for telling me." Karen blinked. "You are not upset?" Marcus chuckled softly. "I would not be honest if I said it never bothered me. But people are complicated. Sometimes fear, assumptions, or misunderstandings get in the way." He looked back at her. "What matters is what people choose to do once they recognize it." Karen felt emotion rise unexpectedly in her chest. She had prepared herself for disappointment, for criticism, perhaps even for rejection. Instead, she found kindness, the very thing she least deserved. Marcus continued. "The fact that you came over here says a lot." Karen nodded slowly. "I should have done it sooner." "Maybe," Marcus replied. "But you did it now." For the first time in months, Karen felt the weight she had been carrying begin to lift. They stood talking for nearly half an hour afterward. Not about complaints or mistakes. About the neighborhood, community projects, families, shared experiences. The conversation felt surprisingly easy. By the time Karen finally returned home, the street looked exactly the same as it always had. Yet something important had changed. The distance that once existed between two neighbors had quietly disappeared. And in its place stood the beginning of genuine understanding. The conversation on Marcus Reed's front lawn marked the beginning of a new chapter, not only for Karen Whitmore but for the entire neighborhood. During the weeks that followed, something subtle began to change. Karen no longer observed community activities from a distance. Instead, she became part of them. On a bright Saturday morning, she arrived early at a volunteer event organized near the playground project. The grass still carried traces of morning dew, and the scent of fresh coffee drifted from a folding table where volunteers gathered before work began. Several residents looked pleasantly surprised to see her there. Karen greeted them warmly and immediately offered to help. As the morning progressed, she found herself working alongside people she had barely spoken to before. Parents, retirees, teachers, small business owners, and students all shared the same goal. For years, Karen had viewed the neighborhood through the lens of property values, regulations, and appearances. Now she was beginning to see something deeper. She was beginning to see people. Marcus moved through the crowd the same way he always did, checking on volunteers, answering questions, and making sure everyone had what they needed. Yet this time, Karen noticed something she had previously overlooked. The influence Marcus had built was not based on wealth or status. It came from trust. People trusted him because he showed up consistently. He listened. He helped. He followed through on his promises. Late that morning, a sudden summer shower moved across the area. Volunteers hurried to protect supplies while families gathered beneath temporary shelters. Laughter filled the air as everyone squeezed together to avoid the rain. Karen found herself standing beside Marcus beneath a large canopy. For a moment they watched the rainfall dance across the playground equipment. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Marcus said. Karen smiled. "A few months ago, I probably would have called it bad timing." Marcus laughed softly. "And now?" Karen looked around at the neighbors sharing coffee, telling stories, and laughing together despite the weather. "Now I think it is part of the day." Marcus nodded. Neither said anything for a few moments. The silence felt comfortable, genuine. When the rain finally passed, sunlight broke through the clouds and reflected from the wet surfaces around them. Children immediately returned to the playground. Volunteers resumed their work. The entire neighborhood seemed brighter. That evening, Karen attended another community gathering, this time as an active participant rather than an observer. During the event, several residents shared stories about how the neighborhood had evolved over the years. Some spoke about challenges. Others spoke about successes. Listening to them, Karen realized that communities were not protected by suspicion. They were strengthened by connection. Near the end of the evening, she stood before a small group and spoke honestly about her own journey. She did not reveal every detail, but she acknowledged that she had learned an important lesson about assumptions and first impressions. The response surprised her. Nobody judged her. Nobody criticized her. Instead, several people thanked her for her honesty. As darkness settled over Oak Ridge Lane and string lights glowed above the gathering, Karen looked across the crowd and saw Marcus speaking with a group of children near the playground. The same neighbor she had once viewed with doubt had become one of the people she respected most. And for the first time in a very long time, Karen felt completely at home in the community she had spent years trying to protect. Several months later, the playground stood complete at the heart of the neighborhood. Bright swings moved back and forth beneath the afternoon sun. Children laughed from climbing structures. Families gathered beneath shade trees while neighbors greeted one another by name. What had once been an empty lot had become one of the most beloved places in the community. On a warm autumn evening, Oak Ridge Lane hosted a celebration to mark the playground's official dedication. String lights stretched between trees, casting a soft golden glow across the gathering. Folding tables held homemade dishes prepared by residents. Music drifted gently through the air while children played nearby. Karen Whitmore moved comfortably among the crowd, stopping to speak with neighbors she now considered friends. Looking around, she sometimes found it difficult to believe how much had changed. Months earlier, she had viewed the neighborhood through fear, assumptions, and distance. Now she saw faces, stories, relationships. Most importantly, she saw people. As the evening continued, several community leaders thanked volunteers who had helped make the project possible. Applause echoed across the park. Families smiled. Children continued playing without realizing how much effort had gone into creating the space around them. Marcus Reed stood near the edge of the gathering, exactly where he seemed most comfortable. Even after everything people had learned about his contributions, he still preferred staying out of the spotlight. Karen watched him for a moment. Then she smiled. Some things never changed. A little later, as the sun began disappearing beyond the rooftops, Karen found herself standing beside Marcus near the playground entrance. Together they watched children race across the grass while parents laughed nearby. The evening felt peaceful, complete. "Quite a difference from the first day," Karen said quietly. Marcus looked toward her with a knowing smile. "It certainly is." Karen shook her head softly. "I spent so much time thinking I was protecting this neighborhood." Marcus remained silent, listening. "The truth is, I did not understand what actually makes a community strong." She looked across the playground. "Now I think I finally do." Marcus followed her gaze. Families from different backgrounds sat together, sharing meals. Children played without noticing differences. Neighbors helped one another clean tables and organize supplies. It was not perfect. No community ever was. But it was connected. And that connection mattered. "People matter," Marcus said softly. Karen nodded. "Yes, they do." The last traces of sunlight faded from the horizon. Porch lights and string lights gradually became brighter against the darkening sky. Around them, conversations continued. Laughter drifted through the cool evening air. Somewhere near the swings, a group of children cheered as they competed to see who could swing the highest. For a long moment, neither Karen nor Marcus spoke. There was no need. The lesson had already been learned. Not through speeches, not through arguments, through experience, through humility, through understanding. Eventually the gathering began winding down. Families packed chairs. Volunteers collected decorations. Children reluctantly headed home. As Karen prepared to leave, she paused one final time and looked back at the playground. The lights reflected softly across the equipment while autumn leaves moved gently in the breeze. Months ago, she had seen Marcus Reed as a stranger who did not belong. Now she understood something she would never forget. Character cannot be measured by appearances. Kindness does not announce itself. And sometimes the people we judge most quickly are the very people who have the most to teach us. Across the park, Marcus helped a young child retrieve a forgotten jacket before returning it with a smile. Then he quietly continued helping clean up, just as he always had. The neighborhood lights glowed warmly against the night sky. Conversations faded. Cars slowly pulled away. And beneath the gentle glow of the playground they had built together, Oak Ridge Lane felt exactly like what it had always had the potential to become: a community.